Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. So I'm Dr. Fargo, and I welcome to this event. We're going to be discussing a very critical issue that concerns us all, which is the fiscal crisis in Illinois. And as the name suggests, we are not going to be talking about politics, right? Enough of politics. And the title is mostly the motivation for, not necessarily because we might be already tired of the electoral process, but mainly because we want to send a strong signal to our elected officials that we are many of us are tired of the political gridlock that persists not only in Washington but Illinois, and that necessary solutions need to be taken now in order to address the conditions in our state. So that is the motivation for this discussion also, and we have, in order to provide solutions, possible solutions, we have two main institutions that are non-partisan organizations which have been closely following and evaluating the conditions, the fiscal conditions in the state of Illinois. We have the Illinois Policy Institute and the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Leaders of those organizations are part of the panel. And before introducing our panelists formally, let me just mention that we also have Mr. Jeff Berkowitz, who is the host and producer of the TV show Public Affairs in Comcast, and he will help me to co-moderate the panel session. So let me introduce formally our presenters. I think, yeah. So first of all, let's start with Mr. Ted Dabrowski. Ted Dabrowski is the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute, where he develops and recommends solutions to the state economic and fiscal problems with focus on budget and tax policy, as well as healthcare, pension reform, education policy, and job creation. Mr. Dabrowski was also leading consultant to the Education Commission for Governor Quinn's Taxpayers Action Board. And he also is a recent graduate from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, as well as holding an MBA in finance from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Our second panelist is Mr. Ralph Martyr, who is Executive Director for the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. In February 2011, Mr. Martyr was appointed to serve on the U.S. Department of Education, Equity, and Excellence Commission, and he is a distinguished lecturer on public policy for Roosevelt University and has taught fiscal policy seminars for various universities and the International Fulbright Scholar Program. Rolf received numerous awards for his work on education policy reform, including the 2007 Champion of Freedom Award, presented to individuals whose professional work embodies the Martin Luther King Jr.'s commitment to equal educational opportunities. So thank you very much for being part of this event. And now, before we introduce the formal format, let me just give you in a minute, or maybe less than a minute, a general overview of the fiscal condition in the state of Illinois. And obviously our experts will explore more in detail the details on our conditions. But a recent report released by the Illinois Budget Crisis Task Force, this is an organization created in Washington. The leader of the organization is former chair, federal chairman Paul Walker. They emphasize key factors that are currently prevailing in the state of Illinois. We know that we have, in terms of pension, the worst unfunded pension liability, with the liability that is in the range of $85 billion. And it's also emphasized in that report that 60% of our debt is actually related to liabilities on pension benefits. Another key factor highlighted in the report is Medicaid cost, who has duplicated from 2000 to 2011. And we have certainly a significant amount of unpaid bills, which in the fiscal year of 2013 was in the range of $8 billion. In a combination of circumstances, main credit rating agencies have downgraded our state condition, and Moody's recently downgraded the state's debt to A2, which is the lowest among 50 states. So these are, again, key facts that I think we have to keep in mind to consider the situation that we are facing and why it's so important to have a serious discussion on this issue. And we have specific data coming from the panelists, but I just want to show you a graph that I think is very interesting, which describes the total debt that our state has per capita compared to other main states. And this is data coming from the same report, the last budget crisis report. And as you can see, Illinois ranks the second highest in terms of debt per capita, just after New York. So again, more information will be presented by our panelists, but I want to now highlight the structure of the panel. The first question will be related to analyzing if we are dealing with a revenue or an expenditure problem in the case of Illinois. And for that, we will have a presentation of each panelist in the range of 3 to 5 minutes. And after each panelist present their views, we might have the opportunity to respond 2 minutes each, one of you. And after that, we're going to have a second question. What are the possible feasible solutions that we can present at this point? Another 3 to 5 minutes for each panelist with the option to respond in 2 minutes after presenting. And after that, Mr. Jeff Berkowitz will present a question to each of the panelists following the presentation that they provided, around 3 minutes or so, depending on the availability of time we have. And then we will have also the possibility to have questions from the audience after that. So that's more or less the basic structure of the event. And again, following the order of that you guys are sitting, we will start then with Mr. Ted Dabrowski, and he will present his view on the conditions of the state and if we are facing a revenue or an expenditure problem.
Dr. Fargo, thank you very much for having us get together. Thank you for other panelists here for joining and all of you for coming in. Dr. Fargo has, I think, expressed some of the difficulties our state is in, and I think what you're going to find is a lot of agreement about the dire situation that Illinois is in between myself and Ralph. It's a very dicey situation in Illinois. But before I talk about that, I want to let you know that both the Illinois Policy Institute and CTVA, we know each other well as institutions. We're in the same circles having a lot of the debates. And I think you're going to hear two very different stories from two very different institutions. CTVA is, of course, a proponent of, I would say, larger government, more taxation. It's a union-funded group, and so they have their views, and you'll hear them proposed in that way. The Illinois Policy Institute, we are a free market organization. We are a nonpartisan think tank, and we believe in free market principles and the principles of the Founding Fathers as being the best force for prosperity in Illinois. So I think you're going to hear very different views. We'll disagree on a lot of the things we say. Ralph will use some data that I think will not be properly presenting the information, and likewise I think Ralph will hear the same thing, but I think what's good about this is that we're both debating and bringing out our information so that you guys can hear different opinions and then do your research and follow through. You guys are students, you're good at challenging what you read and see, and so I think that's going to be a good start. So let me start from there. We have a lot of big problems in Illinois, as were already mentioned. The pension crisis in Illinois is huge. We're not even in agreement yet about how big that problem is, but every day we seem to find out it's growing and it's larger. Retiree health care for state workers is a problem that is only now being understood. It's over $50 billion. We have a Medicaid that's growing out of control. Medicaid, which is meant to take care of the poor, is no longer doing its role. The poor can't get access, yet we've doubled the amount of people that are on Medicaid. So we have a big problem. And when you look at that, you see that when you take all that debt that a lot of you are going to be responsible for, all of us are going to be responsible for, it comes out to be about $51,000 a household. So it's higher than, that was on a per capita basis, it's on a per household basis. But there's a huge risk for all of us. And both Ralph and I will agree that this is not sustainable. It's got to be resolved. And the question is going to be how. But let's keep defining the problem a little bit before we talk about how. It's not just me or Ralph saying that Illinois has a problem. Everybody's starting to say it. And they're not just saying that Illinois has a problem, they're all addressing the fact that Illinois has the worst problems in the nation. Moody's just gave Illinois the worst credit rating in the nation, worse than California, right? Worse than New Jersey. So we can't hide behind these problems. These problems are real. They're real for you and for all of us. We've had 12 credit downgrades since 2008. That means that our trajectory is in the wrong way. And again, we'll all agree on that. Our policies aren't just about too much debt. In the end, they affect people's lives. And what's happening is, if you see this chart is charting the underemployment, which includes the unemployed people, plus those people that can't get a full-time good job that they work for, study for. We're at 16.3%. That's over almost 1.1 million people in Illinois that can't get real work. Okay? That's a lot worse than the national average of 14.6, and much worse than our neighbors at 13.3. So it begs the question, what is Iowa doing differently than us? What is Wisconsin? What are these other neighboring states doing that's better? Or better said, what are we doing worse? We're kind of a black sheep. We have the problem. Our policies are sending people and businesses out of Illinois. If you look at the statistics, one out of so on a net basis, we lose a person every 10 minutes to another state. People are finding real reasons to leave. Some of us will think, yeah, of course, I'd much rather be in Florida where it's, sunny, warm, or maybe California, although fewer people go there. They're losing a lot of people. A lot of people going to Texas. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons for people to leave, to go find jobs, education. But what we're finding is they're not all going to the sunny states, and I'll capture that in the next slide. But on a net basis, we lose one person every 10 minutes. And that's not sustainable for tax revenue reasons, for having better and better employees. We probably lose a lot of valuable people. At the same time, we're losing corporations. You guys might remember last year, Chicago Mercantile Exchange threatened to leave. Sears was threatening. But we did some bad things last year. We passed this thing called the Amazon tax. If you bought something through the internet, through a vendor in Illinois who was helping out Amazon, you would have to pay tax. Well, that immediately forced Fat Wallet to leave Illinois. Coupon Cabin had to leave. Jimmy John's, I know you guys know Jimmy John's. There you go. You're supporting a company that's had huge success throughout the nation, and they've had a lot of success in Illinois. And what we have to do is we have to make sure that those companies stay. We can't chase them away. Is that about 3 minutes or about 5?
5, but
Thank you. The last thing I wanted to say is, look, you'll hear people say, oh, well, Illinois loses people to the sunny states. The fact of the matter is, we tracked over the last 15 years where people are going. The second ranking place that we've lost people to is Indiana. On a net basis, we've lost over 100,000 people over the past 15 years. Wisconsin, 89,000 people. Those aren't sunny states. Those are states pretty similar to us. So the bottom line is, well, real quick, the question is going to be, do we have a revenue problem or a spending problem? Had we grown our spending as a state, this is 1990, we spent $10 billion. Had we grown our spending based on population inflation over the past 20 years, spending would look something like that. If we had grown it based on GDP, where we say, hey, listen, we actually have a lot more resources, we could grow our state spending, it would be closer to $25 billion. The actual spending is at $35 billion. We're spending more than we produce. We're out of control. And so we'll have a disagreement there on where that's, what's the problem, spending or revenues. We have a big spending problem. We need to figure out how to get that controlled. The last item I wanted to show is that even if we wanted to spend more as a state, we're already taxing the heck out of our people. We're the 9th highest on the tax burden per capita. And here's where we're going to disagree on a lot of facts here between Ralph and myself. We're the 9th highest in per capita taxes. We're the 10th highest combined sales tax rate. You guys know this living in the town. We are the 6th highest corporate tax per capita. And we have the 5th highest property taxes. We're taxed. We're tapped out. So when we talk about taxes, spending, opportunity, I want you to think about this because we'll come back to it in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dabrowski. And we're going to present now the same question to Mr. Rod Martir from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability.
Well, thanks. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to define his organization like he tried to define mine. I'll just focus on defining mine. My organization is not nonpartisan. We are bipartisan. My board of directors includes prominent Democrats and Republicans who neither like nor trust each other. This is a really good thing for our staff because it allows us to focus, in fact, on best practices and data. We do not take an ideological view of the world. We don't care if any particular proposal is considered liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between. If it's data-based and it accords with best practices, it's what we support. And just to correct the funding, our organization is primarily funded by foundations like MacArthur, Alpha Wood, Woods Fund in Chicago. And yes, we get some union support. We also get business support and individual support. But anyone that writes a check to us has to understand something. They can't tell us what to conclude. They can't interfere with the research product. And not only do we guard our independence from a research standpoint, we send all our work out to independent peer review by academics across the country. These include academics you've probably heard of at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois, and also prominent practitioners. One of our constant peer reviewers is a guy named Max Sawicki, who's a PhD in economics and also happens to be head of state and local tax for the GAO in Washington, D.C. So we take credibility and accuracy very seriously, and we try to focus on reality. So as for that spending, we do spend right now about $35 billion. That's the top line here. This is the 2013 budget. You'll see the information comes from the different House resolutions, et cetera, that establish the budget. But of that amount, a lot we don't have discretionary authority over. So you'll see something we call hard costs. Debt service, I'll explain statutory transfers out, and the pension contributions. That's $9 billion of the $34 billion in spending. The statutory transfers out are things the state is required by existing law to cover. The largest item in that is something called the Local Government Distributor Fund. The state of Illinois actually shares its income tax receipts with local governments and helps finance them. That's about 1.2, 1.3 billion of the statutory transfers out. And the rest are things like required transfers that were laid on for, in this case, we have one on here, $151 million for Medicaid. All right. This year, uniquely, we've also said we're going to repay some bills, $800 million in past due bills left from last year, $500 to Medicaid in addition to the statutorily required one, another $300 million. That means what we're actually spending on services is significantly less than what it looks like. It's only $24 billion. And you can see the allocation there, pre-K through 12, education, higher ed, Medicaid, etc. Then we have a funky line called unspent appropriations. That just means the Governor and General Assembly have decided they're not going to spend everything that they've allocated out through appropriations, but they're not going to bother to tell us as taxpayers and voters what they're not going to spend on yet. So at some point during the year, these service lines will be cut by an aggregate of $650 million, not telling us where. So the real spending for this year is about $23.5 billion on services. How does that compare to last year? You can see across the board cuts in nominal dollars. K through 12 education, higher ed, Medicaid, flat funded. Group health, that's insurance for our state workers. Human services, public safety, everything across the board cut in nominal dollars year to year. So we're spending less year to year. Our deficit, I think, you noted that we have about an $8 billion in past due bills. Here's how you get to that. We actually have $33.7 billion in revenue. There's our hard cost of 9.3. Our real unpaid bills from last year is $9 billion, not $800 million. So we've got to pay that by law out of this year's revenue. That leaves a total of $15.4 billion for what they've appropriated for services. They have appropriated $23.5. There's your $8 billion hole. That's sort of where we are. Now, is this a spending or a revenue problem? It's not spending. If you look at state spending adjusted for inflation, you can see that as opposed to like, it looks like a 17% increase from 2000 to 2013, it's really a 20% cut after you adjust for inflation using CPI, 23% cut using ECI, the Employment Cost Index, which is far more accurate inflation metric for government spending. We've been cutting spending in an environment where our economy has been lagging the rest of the Midwest in growth since the recession ended. You can see that here. And what's interesting about that is, and I'm going to talk about tax burden right now. Illinois and Missouri, the two states that lag the Midwest in economic growth, have the lowest tax burden. He cited a tax burden figure from the Tax Foundation. Showed us as 9th or 10th highest per capita. What you need to know is that the Tax Foundation does not isolate in-state tax burden. What they do is they say, if you are a resident of the state of Illinois or Kentucky or Alabama, wherever you happen to live, we've constructed a complex econometric model. And that model looks at everything you buy in commerce. And it figures out how much of the prices of the things you buy are taxes imposed by other states on the products and services as they move through the U.S. economy. Then they take all that and say, well, if you live in Illinois and your income is this, your purchases are that, so you've paid this amount of your income in state taxes to all states across America. That's how Illinois comes up high. When you isolate state and local taxes only charged by the state of Illinois, 42nd in the nation. This comes from the Federation of Tax Administrators. All they take are the actual final audited statements of state and local government for how much tax revenue they collect from all sources, and they divide it by your state's total income, and there you go. They do something called math. They isolate state and local burden. The truth is, Illinois has been a very low tax state for a very long period of time. This despite having the 5th largest economy and population of any state. But being low tax has brought us no economic competitiveness. In fact, over the long haul, 97 through 2010, doesn't matter if you go from 1980 to 2007, pick whatever years you want. Illinois has lagged the rest of the nation and the Midwest in economic growth. The reason we have problems in Illinois, and I'm sorry, I gotta just jump to a last slide, is that tax revenue growth over time, we don't have good tax policy, doesn't maintain with service cost growth when you just adjust for inflation and population changes. So every year, our revenue grows at a slower rate than does the cost of maintaining the prior year's level of services. This little blip here just shows you how envious Illinois is of really bad public policy elsewhere. We didn't want the feds to be the only place with a fiscal cliff. We created our own. So we have a temporary tax increase that does begin to phase out, and there you see the phase out in revenue. The truth of this is, for decades, since at least 1980, this is the first time the structural deficit was identified in Illinois by Fred Geertz, a Republican economist at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs. If for years your revenue growth doesn't keep pace with the cost of maintaining your service levels, politicians do a couple of things. They cut services a little bit, they don't raise taxes, but then they borrow. And where we are today is a position where we have borrowed beyond our means. And it is that borrowing that is killing the state. In fact, what we did was we borrowed approximately $40 billion from our pension system to pay for public services over the last 40 years. And now we're paying that borrowing back. And it's the repayment of that borrowing with flat revenues and costs that at a minimum grow with inflation and population that is strangling the state. So unless you fix tax policy to at a minimum grow with the economy over time, you absolutely can't solve your problems.
Okay, thank you so much, Ralph, Arthur. And since it took a little bit longer than expected,
Oh, yeah.
we might need to compensate, so I will give you the 2 minutes response. And then
Oh, this is the response.
Right, you can, yeah, you can go.
It's okay. Yeah, it'd be good.
Yeah.
It's more comfortable talking. It just is.
Okay, you know, I think, Ralph, thanks for those comments. Clearly, part of the reason why I started the way I did was because we do have huge differences already in what we're thinking and saying. I just want to point out one thing before we go on. Ralph has made it very clear his institution is bipartisan. We are not bipartisan, we are nonpartisan. If we don't like what a Democrat proposal is, we don't like it. If it's a Republican proposal that's bad, we don't like it. What we like are free markets, what we like are solutions that make sense to create jobs, to create opportunity for Illinois. And so you'll hear us, we're nonpartisan, we're very clear about that. I think what was interesting about Ralph's comments, and since I'm making the comment, it sounds like it's all about more taxes. So I spoke about the situation where people are leaving the state. I spoke about a situation where companies are leaving the state. Who here would think that, hey, the solution is to actually tax people more? You guys are going to be graduates. Do you want to pay higher taxes when you graduate, or would you rather go to a place where you will make more money, keep more of the hard-earned money that you work for? So I think that's a fundamental difference we have. We think that the reason we have such a big problem in Illinois, why the GDP was so low, is because we are disincentivizing work. We're disincentivizing investment. Higher taxes mean punishment, because we're punishing success. If a company is making more, we take more. If a person is finally getting out of his basement where he's been working hard to create a new product, an entrepreneur, and suddenly he or she starts to have success, we tax them more. That is not a recipe for success. That's a recipe for punishing people and chasing them away to another state. So I think we have to be very careful with that. In the end, what we're talking about here is a spending growth. Thank you for leaving this up. The spending growth doesn't include any reforms. What this means, the spending growth here is big government and government dependency. We think that what Illinois needs is higher revenue, because we have higher growth, and a place that's more dynamic and more exciting to be in. And we think the revenue line has to come down because we finally reform pensions, Medicaid, retiree health care, and combine a vibrant economy with a better managed state. And that's the best solution.
Thank you, Mr. Dabrowski. And so I don't know if you agree, we can actually jump to the next question because it really goes, you can continue the debate on that question too. So the next question will be, what are the feasible solutions? And I'll let you decide who wants to go first. Maybe
Before we
since you
jump
already
to the
have
next
that.
question, I just thought I'd show something.
Oh.
We lost population, according to you, to Wisconsin and Indiana, right? Much higher taxing states than Illinois. I thought I'd point that out. I point that out for a reason. That's because tax policy is irrelevant to migration. Look at the work done by the Center on Budget Policy Priorities, and you will see that people move based on a couple of things. Tax policy not among them. Housing prices, availability of jobs, nexus to family, and of course weather, those kinds of things. Tax policy is in the driver, and that has been pretty much disproven. Leave that slide up there for
Thank
get
you
into
very much.
revenue.
So maybe we can start with Mr. Dabrowski. What are the feasible solutions for our state problem?
I want to point out just one thing before I start on solutions, is that I think it would be a very strange thing that we can say that people are motivated by certain economic factors. but they would totally ignore taxes. So I showed a chart. I showed this chart that has Illinois is the 9th highest tax burden per capita. A point I would make clear, Ralph made some points about how the tax foundation does their numbers. And you know what, they can be all kinds of fancy machinations of what the calculations are. What's most important is what a person pays out of his or her pocket. And an Illinoisan pays about $4,600 out of his or her pocket in taxes. They don't really care where it goes. And that's just, if you live in Illinois, you pay $4,600. That is the 9th highest in the nation. That matters. And so we can disagree about models and how they work. It's just tell me what's the amount of money in cash that I have to pay. And Illinois pay the 9th highest. And that's what matters. Math matters. And I think the simplest math is just tell me how much money is coming in my pocket. In terms of solutions, let me make this. In terms of solutions, we tried perhaps not Ralph's perfect solution, because I know he critiques the tax hike of last year. But last year, in 2011, Illinois had the highest on-record tax increase ever. It increased taxes on Illinois personal income tax 67%. That's a huge increase. It increased taxes on corporations by 45%. Illinois raised $7 billion additional dollars. And here's the promises that you heard. Governor Quinn said, and all of leadership said, we're going to take this money and finally pay down Illinois' unpaid bills. We're going to fix Illinois' fiscal house. And we're going to get Illinois on the right track. Of those 3 promises, they failed on all 3. Illinois now has not over $9 billion in unpaid bills. It got downgraded by Moody's and S&P. And the place is a wreck. So they failed. We gave the government $7 billion more dollars, and what did they do with it? They put it in pensions. They didn't reform pensions. They didn't reform Medicaid. They did nothing except spend the money. And this is the problem with any additional tax grab that we allow politicians to have. They will spend it. And it will become money that can't be reformed later because it is non-discretionary. So really what happened with that is that the solution, I won't go into the details, but pensions have to be resolved, and we have to move away from this defined benefit program we have to one that's like in the private sector, defined contribution plan. Let people control their own pensions and not the government. Retiree health care. For those of you who don't know it, the majority of state workers, when they retire, they get free health care. And that's just not fair in an environment where all those people in the private sector have to survive in the market, in the tough market that we're living in. So that has to change. People should pay their fair share towards their health care. And last, in Medicaid, I mentioned this before, Illinois has doubled in 10 years the amount of people on Medicaid. Medicaid was meant to be for the poor and the people who really needed help. There's a safety net. Almost 25% of Illinois are now on Medicaid. If 25% of people are on Medicaid, how's that a safety net? We're starting to spend money such that we can't control, and we can't let the people who are poor, the truly poor, they can't get into the doctor because the state doesn't reimburse enough to cover those people. In addition to those reforms, what we need is a balanced budget. Illinois has a balanced budget amendment, or requirement, but it's fake, it doesn't work. It allows the state to borrow money and count that as revenues. That's not a balanced budget. That's just borrowing against the future of our children, against you guys. It also allows us to push bills from this year to the next. How's that a balanced budget? It's fake. The second thing we need to do is have a spending cap. We can't allow spending to grow over and over and over again. So with a spending cap, we can control spending and have a sensible budgeting process. Ralph and I have 2 exactly opposite charts on this. I'm going to tell you what I see. We see that the states with no taxes way outperform the states with high taxes in job growth, in population growth, and in output growth. Now, Ralph will say that this is backwards, that Illinois is suffering because it doesn't have enough taxes. I'll say that those other states are doing really well because they don't tax labor. They don't punish people's hard work. What they do is they tax consumption. So we think that the solution for Illinois is to repeal that tax hike we had last year and to put in a plan that moves us towards a 0 tax on income tax. And let us be a really super competitive state. Why can't we be a state like Texas? Why can't we be a state that attracts lots of people, that attracts lots of growth, that attracts the best companies in the world? There's no reason why we shouldn't be that. Some people think that higher taxes will help us get there. We totally disagree. I'm going to save this because I know at some point Ralph and I will discuss his progressive tax discussion.
Give it for the response. And so at this point then Mr. Ralph Martin can take the stand and discuss the possible solutions.
Yeah, let me take a second. I'm not quite sure how to get this back up.
Oh, okay.
Here, is this
One
one
of those
left?
times, that's-
Thank you. All right, so one last thing on the tax burden, because I mean, he keeps going back to it. If the tax burden figure includes the taxes you pay in California, New York, Hawaii, Mississippi, Alabama, what does it tell you about your in-state tax burden? And the answer is 0. And to keep focusing on that is somehow illuminating a discussion when you're trying to decide what your in-state tax burden should be, it's just off point. It is trying to divert you from reality, and the reality is our in-state tax burden is quite low. That's number one. Number two, I've got this slide on it here to show you how income growth got distributed through America. And what you can see is from 1947 to 1979, the wealthiest 10% got 34% of all income growth in our nation, and the bottom 90% got 65%. Then from 1979 to 07, so this leaves out the Great Recession. You don't want that to muck things up. It actually makes things look worse. That flipped. And the wealthiest 10% actually got 63% of all income growth in America, whereas the bottom 90% only got 36%. Here we were building a middle class in our country. Here we're losing our middle class. But for this 90% of earners in America, they have flat or declining incomes over a very long period of time after inflation. The only real difference in policy between here and here was in 1980, we started supply-side economics by cutting tax rates at the very top under the assumption that cutting those tax rates at the very top would stimulate economic growth by freeing up income of affluent individuals to invest in creating jobs, et cetera, and that would trickle down and benefit everyone, grow the economy super fast, and result in everyone earning more and the economy growing at a faster rate. It was also then part of the theory that because the economy would grow at a much faster rate once you had this trickle-down impact, you really wouldn't have much of a deficit problem by cutting tax rates at the top. During this sequence of time, the top federal marginal income tax rate was 91%, and it always hovered somewhere between 75 and 90% for the most part. During this sequence of time, our national economy, GDP, grew by 3.8% per year in real terms, on average, adjusted for inflation. And you see how income growth went. 1980, we cut that top marginal rate on the richest in America down from 90% to 38.5%. Then in 2001, we cut it again down to 35%. As you can see, nothing seems to have trickled down. Everything seems to have bubbled up. And a vast shift in income growth went to the wealthiest 10% who saw their taxes decline. Oh, and as far as economic growth goes, our economic growth in America declined a full percentage point per year on average over the sequence. So there was no trickle down. There was no job stimulation. In fact, the economy performed poorly. That's not a way of me saying, as he keeps trying to say, that our position is you can tax your way to prosperity. You cannot. But you do need a tax system that actually is designed to work in a modern economy. Illinois doesn't have one of those. Illinois has a tax system that was designed to work in an economy that existed at the turn of 2 centuries ago, not the current one. And that won't cut it. And if you don't have adequate revenue in your public sector, what you cannot do is invest in those things like education and infrastructure, social services, that actually create vibrant communities and encourage high-end businesses to locate in your area. So what you need is sound tax policy that comports with a modern economy and generates adequate revenue to support the correct investment in public services. One more thing about economic growth, because, correlation and causation get confused all the time. We don't do that. He showed you a slide that said, and let me give you data, there are 41 states in America with an income tax. 9 states do not have one. This is a comparison on 3 key economic indicators: growth in your state's GDP per capita, growth in median wage, and unemployment rate over a long sequence of time. It's actually a typo there. It's through 2010, not 2012. Okay, so the time period is wrong up there. That's a typo. It should be 2010. This compared the performance in the 9 states in America with the highest marginal tax rates on their income tax versus the 9 no-tax states. And the high-tax states outperformed the no-tax states in every major indicator, except for unemployment rate, which was equal. Once again, it doesn't prove you tax your way to prosperity. It disproves that higher taxes in and of themselves make you uneconomic or non-competitive. It's a far more complex matrix that goes into whether or not your state is competitive. And the factors that go into it do include a public sector that isn't bankrupt, that isn't incurring debt to pay for basic core services, that is investing adequately in public education, that is taking care of vulnerable populations, that is investing in infrastructure. You need tax revenue that's sustainable and that grows with the modern economy to do that. Our proposal would be, yes, to go to a graduated rate structure, number 1, and number 2, to expand our state sales tax base to include services. There are 46 states in America that have a sales tax. Our base, what the tax applies to, is the 3rd most narrow. Why? We exclude virtually all services from taxation. We tax products, things like my costs. This is the percentage the sale of products are in the Illinois economy over time. What we tax has declined from 32% of the economy in 1965 to just 12% in 2008. What we don't tax, services, has jumped from 36% to over 60% of the economy. You simply cannot leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy entirely out of your tax base and balance the budget over time. And interestingly, all of our neighboring states already tax services far more than we do, every single one of them. And in fact, Iowa and Wisconsin, one of those states we lose population to, taxes all the services that we think you should tax that we currently don't. You need a tax system that'll work. One last thing, because it's been said a couple times. My organization doesn't have a stance on big government, small government. We think that's a silly question to ask. We don't support every tax that's come down the pike. In fact, I testified against Rod Blagojevich's gross receipts tax. I don't know if you remember that proposal a few years ago. I was given the floor right after the governor spoke, and I said why it was a horrible way to tax. You need sound tax policy designed to work in a modern capitalist economy that supports an adequate investment in core public services. And if you don't have that, you will not be economically competitive. It's that simple, and that's what we stand for.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ralph Martyr. And I'm sorry, I have to put limits.
No.
All this information is quite relevant, but unfortunately we don't have the whole full day. And I mean, we're kind of behind. I wonder if you would like to respond for 2 minutes maximum each, or maybe we can go directly to the questions presented by Jeff.
I'd like to respond, please.
Okay. 2 minutes.
That's one of his tricks. That's one of your tricks. You start the clock.
Keeping the clock is very important. The timekeeper, that's the most important thing here. I'm not keeping the clock.
Thank goodness.
The most important person.
All right, so if I heard right, and I don't think you're trying to make a causation here, but if I heard right that the growth rate of the U.S. dramatically dropped because we stopped taxing the rich. If I heard right that we lost the middle class because we stopped taxing the rich. And if I draw the...
Well, you didn't hear right, because I made it clear it disproves the theory that if you cut taxes, things grow. It does not prove the theory you can tax your way to prosperity.
I'm sorry, I was thinking
So
about the other slide.
Okay, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I said it right then and there, and I'm just not gonna have your organization continue to put words in my mouth. So
Okay.
let me just be very clear. We
Just
have
to my
said,
2 minutes.
we have said repeatedly
No,
that
go ahead. I'll let you
confusing
finish the
of
point.
correlation with causation is a problem. And the problem with supply side economics is it doesn't admit the existence of other economic factors. It is, if you do this, then that will occur, theory, irrespective of what else is happening in the economy. It hasn't worked. That disproves the theory. That means you have to look at another way of taxing society. That's all we say.
Okay, so
Mr.
I,
Martin, you took already 1 minute of
Yes.
your response.
so I've heard that comment, but what you said very clearly was, when we stop taxing the rich, the middle class. So you made those points pretty clear. If you say that I
Those are the
did, that's what I heard. So now it's the data, so it is a causation.
Let's give another.
And I think the other thing is about big government. I think, and I haven't done enough research on your institution to know, I haven't heard you talk about Medicaid reform. I have not heard you talk about pension reform and exactly how we get there. So what I do know is you supported the largest tax hike in history last year. So, and maybe you didn't like the Blagojevich tax because it wasn't the right one, not because you didn't want taxes. So I think what we're trying to say, higher taxes, what we're trying to say is that we have a very different approach to how we approach the reforms. One thing that I want to point out, and this is very important because what Ralph has not said in his proposal for a progressive tax, ignore the amount of numbers there. Today, Illinois pay a 5% flat tax, and in 2015 they'll pay a 3.75% flat tax according to law. If you look at all the red states there, all of those progressive tax states, and all of them have a higher tax rate on a person making $50,000 on a middle class family. They all tax more than today's flat tax system. So Ralph is not talking about taxing the rich. He's talking about taxing the middle class. And he won't say that, but that's really what's in the proposal. The other thing that's heavily proposed in this documentation is that he will cut taxes for 94% of Illinoisans. The fact of the matter is that Ralph assumes that the tax rate will not sunset to 3.75 under law. He assumes that it'll stay at 5%. So we have to be careful about what these tax proposals mean, and I know we'll discuss it more in a moment.
And Mr. Martin, you want to
Yeah, well,
add something
just
to
'cause-
1 minute?
The Illinois Policy Institute just loves talking about our proposals without actually, I don't know, reading them.
I've read it very
So the
closely.
bottom line is, on our graduated rate proposal, what we do is we exempt the first $5,000 of income from taxation, which currently is not Illinois law. We currently tax $1. And then we put in a graduated rate structure over that. We've run it through this proposal through the Illinois Department of Revenue's dynamic model, which takes real Illinois tax returns and has a methodology for accounting for tax avoidance techniques and other things individuals will do once rates are changed, et cetera. And the net is, according to the Illinois Department of Revenue, that 94% of the state would actually see their income taxes go down, and there would be a tax burden shift to the wealthiest 6%. If you want to know about what the income cutoff there, it would be taxpayers filing on average $150,000 of taxable income or less would see their income taxes go down. And that's according to the Illinois Department of Revenue running our proposal.
I must just respond to that. Ralph, then I would assume that you would admit that you're using a 5% rate.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
that's current law. We did it under current law.
But that's not, but you could not pass a progressive tax until 2015, when current law will have rates at 375.
Right.
So I think it's deceiving.
But no, but
to
the
tell everyone.
but the differential would be de minimis. It would still be a substantial tax cut for people earning up to about 80 or 85,000 a year. The cutoff wouldn't be 50. We've
But
run
your
it
proposal-
through their model. The proposal is based on existing law. Existing law is 5 points.
You
But
could
we
make-
don't back away from saying it could go up to 8, in which case you modify it a little bit if you want to keep it at 150. The bottom line is we're for progressive taxation because all income growth in America for the past 30 years has been concentrated in the wealthiest 10%. One of the core principles of sound tax policy in any fiscal policy textbook is that your taxes must respond to where the economy is growing. A flat income tax doesn't allow you to do that, a graduated rate structure does.
Okay, well, let me just move on. And at this point, I would like to give Mr. Jeff Barkowitz the opportunity to ask one specific question to each of our panelists, and he will have around 3 minutes to respond to that question. So, Jeff, would you like to?
Can I do that there?
Yeah, you can. Move on there. And the question?
Well, let me suggest, if you agree, a slight alteration of the format. These gentlewomen and ladies, gentlewomen and men have been sitting here patiently, quietly for an hour. I think it would be better if we gave them a chance to ask some questions. I reserve the right. Let me just ask, is there anybody here who has to leave before 1:30? Okay, so it means they can all
Is
stay.
there anybody here who wants to leave?
No, don't give them that choice. Ralph, I've done this. You don't want to give them a choice. Usually we do. No, but
John already
seriously.
got
We'll
it.
have to go for the ones who stay.
All right, yes. he's getting
Another
out.
20 minutes. maybe.
All right, so I'll reserve my 5 minutes more toward the end. But let me just moderate this if we can, and if somebody objects, then you can do it, or Ralph, or Ted, or somebody in the audience. So let me just ask if anybody here has some questions for either Ralph or Ralph Martiri, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, or for Ted Dabrowski, who's Vice President of Public Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. It seems to me, and I'll say this very succinctly, I do a TV show and I've been grappling with a lot of these issues, although actually this has been an excellent discussion. And I think you ought to have them both back for the next step, which would be the detailed discussion of Medicaid reform, education reform, pension policy reform. But I've been talking about this stuff for a year. I've learned an incredible amount. So you folks are blessed. You've had two very good speakers here for the last hour. So ask any question you want, but I would think you might want to try to focus, if you don't, I will. What are the main things coming out, and what are the real differences between these two gentlemen? Because we can get down in the weeds, and they've been in the weeds for a minute. I mean, I'm complimentary. They've been high level stuff, but they can get in the weeds real quickly. So let me see, Emily, do you have a question?
Well, I don't really know much about economics or taxes or anything, but I was just wondering, is there kind of a happy medium belief that incorporates both, or is it just pretty much strictly either this or that? Does that question make sense?
Either one.
Let's go first this time.
Well, so that's how we approach the policy analysis, where we don't start up with a foregone conclusion or an ideological view. I think Ted made it clear that they are a free market based think tank, so they are looking for policies that support free market ideals. Whether it's in financing government or spending or whatever, they look for those types of solutions. Sometimes we support those kinds of solutions, and sometimes we support other solutions. The bipartisan nature of our organization was designed specifically to take the partisan and ideological views out and to say, okay, what is the data telling us about real long-term trends? And what do best practices tell us, and how do we meld them together to a policy proposal, which is why my organization has been strongly supportive of tax increases at the state level, designed the right way. But we, for instance, testified against the sales tax increase at Cook County. It's a bad piece of public policy. Cook County didn't need that money, and in fact, it had a long way to go to prove it was being efficient, et cetera. So it just depends on how you approach policy. And I guess we've decided if you're very concerned with taking an ideological view, you are bound to just try to force a round peg into a square hole occasionally. And we try to take ideology out of it and focus on data and best practice.
But before we go to Ted, Ralph, in 30 seconds, the question was, in your view, is there a happy medium between you and Ted on this?
I can't, that would be up to
But
Ted.
in your view, is there a happy medium? In your view?
In our view, our policy initiative is one that should be supported by liberals or conservatives or Democrats or Republicans because it is data-based and it has been peer-reviewed and vetted, and it's predicated on standard public finance principles. But that's our view, and I'm sure Ted has a different view,
All right, Ted.
which he's
Thank you,
entitled
Ralph. Yeah, we take a totally different view. We are principled. And that principle is about the individual, it's about choice, it's about liberty, it's about freedom. And we don't believe that data can justify in any way taking away somebody's liberties. I'll give you 2 examples of that. There might be all kinds of data that says we should spend more and more money on the public school system. If you look at Chicago, it's a failed public school system. Kids are forced to go, based on their zip code, to a failing school. A school that has failed for 10 years, they're forced to go to it. And I don't care whose policy it is that says that that's the right formula. We disagree with that. We believe that that child should have a choice. If we believe that the child should have an access to education, then we believe that that child should get a voucher from the state, for example, and choose where to use that. The family should choose where that child should go and the best way to do it. I'm not smart enough to tell that parent, and I don't want to deem myself smart enough to tell that parent how to live their lives. I think they should get the money and not be forced to do something. Same thing on taxation. We think it's very discriminatory if you go after the rich, the successful, the entrepreneur. You know, our CEO has said it very well. We champion people who succeed. We champion an entrepreneur who's in the basement trying to make something work. And when they start succeeding, we don't want to then vilify them when they're successful. And what you're hearing today, and what you hear on the press all the time, is the top 1%, they should be vilified, they should be taxed more, they're the bad guys. And we think that's wrong. So we come from an ideology where we think that people should be free, the market should provide most of the solutions. Look, the poor distraught, we have to take care of. We believe that we have to make sure that education is available, but we don't believe, for example, the government should be the one providing it.
I got $5 to anyone in the audience to find the statement I said today that vilified anyone who's affluent. $5.
And I didn't say Ralph vilified.
It's great to set up straw men to knock down, but I don't appreciate words placed in our mouths.
Ralph, and
We don't vilify the affluent. We look at tax policy, we look at real income growth, and we design it to respond to where the economy is really growing. If a disproportionate share of overall income growth is growing in top income classes, that's where you need to focus your taxation.
A response by Ted, and then we'll go to the next question.
yeah, I think anything that says, and if you take the California example, California just voted to tax the wealthiest people even more. They gave a choice to all the people who were making less than the rich. They gave them a vote on whether they should tax the rich more. If that's not discriminatory, if that's not allowing a 95% of the crowd to tax the richest, that's discriminatory. And yes, I call it vilification because you may not call it that. But if you think that we can tax those people who are successful without calling it vilification, as if it's okay to take their hard-earned money, their hard-earned benefits, these are the job creators, these are the people that provide a lot of the opportunity in entrepreneurship, I call it vilification. You may call it sound tax policy.
Actually, I would call them more job facilitators. Let's just respond to each other on this because that's another standard line.
Try to keep it short. So
Yeah, what's the economy? Does anyone here know what the economy is, what really constitutes economic activity in America and Illinois? It's consumer spending. 68 to 70% of all economic activity is consumer spending. The job creators are folks like you and me buying junk and such. That is the economy. And so what the people at the very top do is actually facilitate job creation as long as we're buying enough junk and such. But if we don't have the skills, if we weren't given the public education of sufficient quality that we developed the numeracy, literacy to go on and credential ourselves in college, we're not going to be very good consumers because we've consigned ourselves to a lower wage over time. So net, the reality is you tax your society in accordance to where the economy is growing. When you're just looking at sectors, sales taxes should go to services because that's the sector that's growing, not on goods, that's the sector that's declining. When you look at income taxes, income should go to where the incomes are taxes, where the incomes are growing fastest and people are paying taxes out of their growing wealth rather than where people would pay it out of their growing poverty or flat income over time. That's fair and responsible.
Okay,
So do I have 30 seconds on that?
You can have a
You
minute.
want to add 30 seconds?
I only need 30.
Okay.
What I'm hearing is that these people with wealth don't actually create jobs. They don't have the resources. They don't invest in the factories. They don't make the Apple machines, the computers. Somehow those goods just get there. So I don't agree with that. And I'll leave it there.
All right, let's go to the next question.
First of all, you guys will have to forgive me because your last name's Underhill. I don't know how to so I'll call him.
You
I'll
can call me
him.
Ralph, I'm
You call me
Ted.
okay with that.
So I have two more specific questions. One deals with comment that Ted made about healthcare, and then also what was mentioned about voucher system. So first about healthcare, you mentioned all government employees in the state of Illinois receive free healthcare after retirement. Is that what you
Correct,
said?
not all, most.
Okay, most, because I thought I heard all. So to Ralph, what is your belief on, you know, what do you see? Do you think that's too much of an expenditure to have most of government employees after retirement getting free
Yeah,
healthcare?
we've consistently said.
Excuse me, just a second, we now got a clock, so you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, we've consistently said that the retiree health care benefit is a little over generous, but it's not entirely a free benefit. Workers in the system throughout their career set aside 4% of their wages and paid it in to the state to fund their benefit on retirement. That 4% of wage isn't adequate to fund the full benefit that they're getting. And that's one of the problems, right? We set up a funding system that was inadequate for the benefit being given. And so you have to readjust that. But they do pay, just like anyone else would pay in a healthcare system, their deductibles and their co-pays and all that other stuff. So it's not entirely free, and they did pay into it. It's still an overgenerous benefit given the state's current fiscal condition, and it should be.
Ted, comments before we go to the second?
Yeah, there's contributions, they are teeny. The amounts that are set aside today are zero for all retired, they're zero. So we're paying retiree health care for state workers out of current operating funds. So that means less for the classroom, et cetera.
Also, can you define state work, like, what
Sure,
the
so-
definition of who gets?
So these are state employees, universities, mostly state employees and universities are the big chunk. And
So not teachers, for
Not
instance,
teachers.
are also funded by the state, but not.
Yeah, see that, I honestly, I have to admit, I don't know state employees specifically what that parameter, I mean, so in what sectors then of state?
Those would be people employed by the state.
Okay.
Because teachers aren't employed by the state, teachers are employed by school districts throughout the
It'd be
state.
primarily
They're
social
still-
workers, people in the Secretary of State's office that are issuing you your driver's license.
Okay.
It's what you think of as your standard state-based.
Sorry, people who work in a variety of agencies across the state of Illinois, especially in Springfield, Department of Agriculture, Department of Human Services, Children and Family Services. So there are a number of agencies across in the
They're
state
not-
government, and in those
Not-
agencies, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who, state employees, I think across the state, Ralph would know this much better than I, probably Ted would, roughly the number of state employees, as we just discussed, is,
150,000.
that's as I, Ralph would.
That's about right. We
Okay.
rank 49th in the number of state workers per capita in the nation.
Gives you some idea.
Indiana is 50th, in case you're wondering who's below us.
All right, did you have a second question?
And just the fact, so if you work for 20 years as a state worker, you pay nothing towards your health retiree costs to your premiums. Your premiums are free.
All right, so my second question was the voucher system, because this issue was kind of brought up to the national scale too, especially with the recent presidential debate and stuff like that. And the voucher system to me, it hasn't really been well articulated, and or maybe I just haven't done enough reading, so I'm a little confused. To me, when I think of voucher systems, though, the confusing part is that the government is giving these families vouchers to send their kids to school wherever they want, which to me sounds like we're still incurring expenditures. And I know that the theory is it'll be a less an expenditure than to just have a publicly funded school. But also when I think of the incentives for an entrepreneur to go into a struggling community that clearly has a failed education system already, it sounds like to me they're going to incur greater costs if they truly do want to provide a strong education system for this community. They're going to have to put even more money than if maybe they're going into communities which already have a good public school system. So can you explain, because I know that you were, Ted, you were the one who was talking about the voucher system. What is the theory behind why private entrepreneurs are going to be incentivized to cut costs in a failed educational
I think we
environment?
have a question. Take 90 seconds, Ralph, you take 90 seconds.
All right.
And we'll see if we need more after that.
Okay, I want you to think about whether school choice exists today to begin with. And the answer is it exists in fullness. When a family that lives in Chicago has children, a white family with good earnings, or it could be a black family, if they make enough money, they leave the city of Chicago to find better schooling outside. Choice number one. So school choice is there. If they can find a great private school in the city, then they're doing it. Many private schools cost around $6,000, much less than what it costs CPS to educate their children. So school choice exists. There are private institutions already there. The third choice that exists already are charter schools. My colleague Josh Dwyer is here. Josh just wrote a great paper on the charter schools, and I highly recommend you read it. Charter schools are taking the
Excuse me,
same,
where can they go to read it?
IllinoisPolicy.org, and I'll show that in a minute. They can, children, if they win the lottery, unfortunately they have to win a lottery, they can't just go there because there's not enough capacity yet. They have the choice if they can get in. It's the same makeup of low income, a lot of Hispanics, some of them with special ed issues. Those kids are succeeding. When given a chance and getting really good schools in these same neighborhoods that you're talking about, they're succeeding. What we don't have is enough opportunity. The public school system, the government model, we're not able to break it. And so that's why we need choice.
Time. Ralph.
Choice can't work. So if you look at every nation that has turned around its public education system, remember I'm on a federal commission looking at changing education policy in America. I'm a full voting commissioner. If you look at every other nation that we compare ourselves to that in fact has turned its public education system around and went from being a poor performing nation to a high performing nation, whether it's Canada or Finland or Singapore, whatever, they didn't use choice. They didn't drive with accountability. They focused on capacity building in their communities of poverty, building up the pedagogical skills of the extant staff, bringing in better staff, enriching the academic program, lengthening the school day, and paying what it costs to do that. In other words, their goal was not to turn around 5% of the schools that were underperforming, but get at least 95% of the schools to provide a high-quality education. Now, it took time and it took significant commitment of resources, but they were successful. And Canada has a demography very similar to America's demography, especially the province of Ontario. So the bottom line is what you really need is a public school system that has the capacity to provide that high-quality education to every child, no matter where they live. And choice won't get you there, and it can't get you there. I mean, right now, can you imagine if you're a low-income family actually having the capacity to get your kid maybe to a suburban school that's a better school? And the answer is you really don't. You can't get there. Private schools, unlike public schools, can discriminate. It's perfectly legal. They don't have to take the kid. And when
Finish up, please.
okay, so when demography is actually taken into account and private school performance is compared to public school performance, it turns out public schools outperform. They just have to deal with a lot more problems than a private school does. Private school has non-at-risk kids who are very likely to achieve academically. So it is a problem that is solvable, but choice vouchers won't get you there. And in fact, I just want to say one more thing, and we will be releasing a paper on this in January. Even the major proponents of vouchers over time have now admitted that a voucher system will not enhance student achievement. So if student achievement enhancements are what you want, that's not vouchers. They have switched their advocacy on vouchers to choice is a good public policy option in and of itself. And that's a defensible position, certainly, but it's not tied into education.
Ralph, can you just tell them where they can find that?
Well, we're gonna publish it in January. We're gonna do some press about it, but our website is ctbaonline.org. It'll be available.
Thank you. I think you went over about a minute, so let me give a minute, Ted, if you want to, and let me raise one other topic briefly related to this, and then we'll go to the next question. So you've got a minute, Ted,
Okay.
as wrap up the response, but then take a minute after that to just tell us roughly, maybe you only need 30 seconds, what's the cost of the Chicago public school education per kid per year? And I focus on that because not everybody, but very many people would say, in the suburban Chicago metro areas, schools are reasonably good and fine. The Chicago public schools, many would say, not so good. So let me ask you that question. Chicago public schools, what in your view is the cost per kid per year, total cost? But start with the response to Ralph and then make the second one.
If I could ask the young lady's name.
Emily.
Emily?
Yeah.
Thanks. Emily, you asked about ideology just a few minutes ago. And Ralph said that they don't have an ideology. But I think what was really clear about the difference between us, and he'll say I'm putting words in his mouth again, but I can't help it. He said that choice can't work. And what we're talking about to an economics group here is that choice can't work, and we totally disagree with that. That's an ideology. We believe that choice does work, and even if it doesn't work, it's your choice about how you live your life, how you spend your life. And so that's the big difference between what we're saying.
Ours is a database analysis of choice systems actually implemented.
Ralph,
rather
excuse
than
me,
an ideological
let
response.
Ted
So
finish.
If he's gonna summarize.
No,
my
you get a
comments-
chance,
you go after me.
You'll get a chance to.
But you were very clear, choice can't work, and that's ideologically, we have a big difference there. Ralph is, well, I think it's ideology. Ralph is sourcing a lot of research that is, again, the opposite. I think what we're doing here is showing you there's two different worlds. He's living in a world where choice does not work for education. We're telling you that the success of some of the charters, not all charters are successful, the success of charters, the success of online learning, the success of giving people in the market a chance to provide that education, because Ralph's model is to throw more money at education, because that's really what's missing in his model. It needs more money. We have spent records amount of money on education, and we keep getting worse and worse results.
Before we go to the cost issue, Michelle, ask you to address it. Ralph, did you want to respond now?
Yeah, just really quickly. So it's not an ideological view at all. Actually, voucher systems have been proven to work anywhere they've been implemented. We support them. The problem is the data show that they haven't worked. And if something doesn't work, we don't believe in expending public resources on it, nor trying to justify it with a purely ideological stance. So there's the differential. Second, the charter phenomenon. So once again, all the studies have come back that charters actually overall underperform existing public schools. They do not overperform, and then you isolate the demographics of the students and the ones that do outperform, what you find is the charter school system has both creamed and cropped, and what that means is they cream the best kids out of a community and put them in that charter school, and for a number of reasons. And then they have, unlike the public school systems, a facile ability to crop out kids that aren't cutting them. They don't need to keep them on board, whereas the public school system has to keep the kid in there unless the kid is basically carrying on and shooting folks. So those are some of the differentials we see.
Before we go to cost, a minute.
Sure.
Response, if you want.
Sure. What I'm hearing, again, is ideology, where, Emily, if you were that poor child and your family was not doing well economically, but your parents really cared about you, there's a lot of those people in the South Side, where they're not doing well, but they care about their children. Ralph's going to come up to your house and say, you know what, the data tells us that you can't make a choice. We're not going to give you a choice because the data, we ran the data, you can't have that choice. And that's his model. Our model, and you talk about ideology, our model is, listen, you are free, and you should be free. And we will help you, we'll give you that voucher, but you take that money, and what works best for you and your family, and the way you learn, the type of learning you want to do, the type of school you want to do, that's what we're providing. And I think that's the big difference. So when we talk about here, we're talking about tax policy. But behind everything we think about tax policy that way. And Ralph approaches it in a very different way. So his education ideology, he won't like that I'm saying that, his education ideology moves on to his tax ideology.
Ted ran over for 30 seconds. Would you like 30 seconds, Ralph?
Yeah, no, go right back to it, Jeff. What we do is we look at what has actually worked. We look at what has worked around the world, what has worked in the U.S., and we say that is the structure we ought to implement. We ought to implement what works. We ought not implement what doesn't work. It's that simple. And then if you're going to implement what works has specific cost. And in fact, we think school funding ought to be tied to what's called an evidence-based model, and the evidence that's based on is those practices that have actually resulted in higher student achievement, and you can cost those out and pay for it. That's where we think it should go. We think every public school should provide a high-quality education based on the evidence of what drives student achievement. I don't think that's ideological at all. It's looking at what works.
Can we cut it there? Or Ted, do you need 15 seconds?
I'm good.
Okay, let's cut it there. We're going to go to closing statements.
Right.
I just want to ask each in 30 seconds, and I won't let you say anymore. 30 seconds. What is the cost of the Chicago public school system per kid per year of that education?
Okay, so depending on either elementary or high school, anywhere between 11,000
On
and
average,
13,000.
K through 12.
Under 13,000, but around 12,000.
Ralph, do you agree?
Yeah, 11 and change, about 11.6, 11.
Okay, just, I hope it doesn't show bias on my part. My way of doing it would be to ask what's the total budget in the Chicago Public Schools divided by the number of students. I think in the last year or two, the budget has hovered above and below $6 billion. I think now it's been cut, so it might be $5.4 billion. I think a year or two ago, it was actually higher at $6 billion. So besides the quick math, if you took $6 billion and you divide it by the 404,000 students, which is the number CPS gives, you get $15,000 per kid per year. So these two gentlemen have a different view. That's my view. It shows even when you're talking about facts, maybe.
Jeff, what you're including is capital expenses.
I intend to,
and so what we
I
are
intend
looking
to.
at is operational.
So if you
expenses.
include capital costs, you both would agree it's roughly 50.
Yeah, you bump it up, of course.
All right,
So
thank
if
you.
you allow me, Jim, now at this point, I want to go back to our initial discussion on the general fiscal condition, and I will allow each of you 2 minutes final remarks on what you consider will be the feasible solution for the fiscal crisis in the state of Illinois. So 2 minutes there and
Okay.
2 minutes. Sure.
I'm going to use a slide. I want to use what's happening in California to show you what Ralph's plan of a progressive tax means. They always talk about taxing the highest income people. That's the plan. We're going to tax the rich. They don't pay enough. Okay? But the reality is that these progressive tax plans, look at them. You can go to Tax Foundation. You can see every progressive tax state and how their brackets are set up. In Illinois, in California, if you make greater than $38,000, the marginal tax rate, or whatever you make above $38,000, is 8%. Today in Illinois, if you make that amount, it's 5%. And according to law in 2015, it will be 3.75. In California, it's 8. This was the progressive tax meant to be for the rich. The rich have now become $38,000. If you start making above $48,000, you pay 9.3%. If you make $250,000 in California, you pay 10.3. So here's what they do. They creep down the ladder, they call it. It's a creepy tax. It punishes success. If you're making $38,000 and you have this great product and you finally start to make money, you've been sweating for 3 years making your product. You start to earn a little bit of more money, they punish you. So $250,000 could easily be 2 teachers that are married and working in California, each making around $130,000 each. And we're going to tax them 10.3%. This is the progressive tax plan. Look at all of them. It's not about taxing the rich. Oh yes, they also tax the rich. They just passed this, this was voted yesterday, Proposition 30. They decided they're going to go, somebody with $1 million before, 2 days ago, was going to be taxed at 10.3. Now they're going to be taxed at 13.3. They're going to tax the 500,000 people at 12.3. You tell me if this doesn't drive people away. At the margin, it won't drive everybody away, but it will make people think about where their next investment dollar goes. If Illinois does this, it's going to make all those who don't like what they see, the governors in jail, the worst credit rating, people leaving, they're going to think about whether they invest. And same thing for you guys here. When you graduate, you have to think about where you work. Are you going to work in a vibrant state, one that doesn't tax your hard work? You have to think about it. So thank you very much. You can find our information at illinoispolicy.org. And thank you guys for joining today.
Ted, I just found something we agree on. Governors going to jail is bad.
Okay, Mr. Matter,
So
your
there you go.
final
We
remarks.
agree. I knew I'd find something. I don't know how to get out of this.
Okay.
There we go. I think I got lucky. You know what's funny about this actually? Is I actually teach technology law at Northwestern Law School, and I cannot make a computer work. All right, so the end game is pretty simple. Illinois' tax policy meets none of the principles of sound taxation for a modern capitalist economy. And if any area of public policy doesn't meet your core principles for how it should work, it won't, and ours doesn't. That results in this structural imbalance. And so you can't solve this problem with cuts, even if you were so inclined to cut spending. But let's assume in the year 2022, Oberweis, the 37th time he runs for governor, actually gets elected. and he decides to cut expenditures right down to revenues. The problem will be because our revenues don't grow with the modern economy, but our costs at a minimum, remember this is just adjusted for inflation and population changes. At a minimum, our costs will, so the very next year you have a deficit. If your tax policy doesn't work, you cannot sustain investments in core public services. Historically, over the last 40 years, Illinois has spent 9 out of $10 on services on 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, taking care of vulnerable populations, and public safety. That's it. So if you have to cut, those are the services you cut. That hurts families, that hurts communities, and that leads to a declining economy. I will note that the states with higher taxes than Illinois have historically outperformed us in GDP, by the way, including California. I will note one other odd thing about California, which has some of the very highest marginal income tax rates. It has a problem with immigration of millionaires. They're not leaving the state, they're moving to the state. They have not been a net migration state. So the bottom line is people make those decisions based on quality of life. Based on whether or not, if you're going to put a business in a community, whether or not that community has workers that have the numeracy, literacy skills you need for your enterprise. Illinois and its inability to invest in those core services has driven businesses away because we're not creating the kind of place that can really house high-end businesses that pay good jobs. We need to fix it. We need to grow up. We need to tax ourselves the right way for a modern economy. And if we did that, we could still remain relatively low spending, solve our deficit problems, and pay our debt. I also have one more thing. Each of Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's have over the last 5 years says Illinois needs to increase its taxes to be able to do this. That's it.
Thank you so much. You know, even though this is not a political debate, it was better than the presidential debate, I believe. So thank you so much. Please give a round of applause.